China's urban history is almost as long as the history of China itself, with urban archaeological sites stretching back to before the Shang dynasty in 1600 BCE, and the received record listing capitals for the legendary pre-Xia rulers. But the Warring States period marks a singular time in the evolution of the Chinese city. No longer city-states, not yet imperial capitals and outposts, the cities of the Warring States were defined, more than anything, by their changes. Throughout history, Chinese capitals have retained a remarkable similarity, and this feature seems to have been present from the beginning. Out of several dozen state capitals, only three fundamental typologies emerge. The first typology is the earliest, and went on to be the model for many subsequent imperial capitals. Called the concentric city model, it was defined primarily by a rectangular outer wall and a smaller walled palace complex located within the outer city. The second model is rarely encountered and is similar to the first, except that the palace complex is located in the north of the city, sharing a wall with the northern border of the outer city. The third model is particular to the Warring States period. Called the double city, it involves two more separated walled compounds. Unlike the concentric city, the double city is not an idealized type laid out in a text, but rather a pragmatic response to real-world conditions. Thus, scholars are still discussing the nature of this type of city. Were both compounds built at the same time, or did one precede the other? Did the two compounds have different roles to play? What was the relationship of the palace complex to the walled enclosures? The answers seem to vary from city to city. To answer some of these questions, we will look at the city of Linzi, capital of the state of Qi and one of the greatest cities of the Warring States. Linzi was the final city to fall to King Zheng of Qin, who would soon after become the first emperor of China. Located in between two rivers, Linzi is a double city, with a smaller compound overlapping the larger compound's southwest corner. The smaller compound is the palace or administrative center of the city, while the larger compound houses the city's lower functions: industry, markets, housing for commoners, etc. In the case of Linzi, the larger city predates the smaller one. The smaller compound and many of the buildings within it were constructed during the Warring States period, while the larger city had been constructed much earlier. As the city transformed from an outpost of Zhou to a city-state to a territorial state, the bureaucracy grew in complexity, and a palace complex was carved out of the southwestern corner. The larger compound was divided by wide, straight streets forming a grid. These 7 major roads divided the city into wards. There is little received record of the details of this portion of the city, although the description of the palace compound is extensive. Inside the palace complex, the most arresting feature is the platform of Duquan, which we will return to later. But just how big was Linzi? Let's look at a familiar space for comparison. Here is Austin, Texas, with Mopac I-35 and the original 40 acres of campus called out. If we superimpose the capital of ancient Qi, we can see that it takes up a good portion of our city. If we rotate Linzi, it fits pretty snugly in between I-35 and Mopac, stretching from Dean Keaton in the north down past Zilker Park in the Long Center in the south. If you prefer a different metric, ancient Linzi was roughly the width of Manhattan Island and the length of Central Park. Now that we've gotten a sense of the size of the city, what about the size of the walls? This is more difficult to ascertain, as only the foundations of the rammed earth walls were evident during excavation. The widest portion of the wall was just east of the north gate of the small city, spanning 67 meters. The narrowest portion was the southern wall of the large city, varying from 25 meters at its widest to 17 at its narrowest. This is surprising. Why would the outer city wall be less fortified than the inner wall, connecting the administrative city with the larger city? Mark Edward Lewis calls attention to 3 related changes occurring during the Warring States period: the transition from city-state to territorial state, the rise of the Shi class, and the conflict between government and marketplace. The kingdom of Zhou begins with its capital. As Zhou grew in power and the royal lineage longer, cities and their surrounding territory were given to relatives of the ruler in exchange for fealty and helping to strengthen the kingdom. During the spring and autumn period, the Zhou capital lost its power, severing the ties among the cities and leaving them to function as city-states, administering themselves and the immediate surrounding land. During this time, the main societal distinction was between those who lived within the city and those who lived without. As even the symbolic authority of Zhou diminished and rulers began to vie for power, they stretched military conscription and taxes further into the hinterland. Suddenly, Land became a state commodity and was incorporated into the administration until city-states became territorial states, sharing borders with other states. This macro phenomenon had a specific effect on the city. Farmers began mingling with people in the city as conscripts, and a division grew up between those with access to the palace city and those left out in the peripheral area, merchants, laborers, and artisans. This division was heightened by changes in the political system of the warring states, specifically the rise of the Shur class. Through their philosophical teachings, the Shur carved out a role in between the ruler and the common people, bolstering bureaucratic administration with moral authority. Administrators were distinct from the common people not by inheritance, but by self-cultivation. A further division grew between palace city and greater city, strengthened by the final element, the troubling factor of the marketplace. During the Western Zhou, the paramount authority of the Zhou king allowed for flexibility and deliberation in local governance. Because the Zhou king's authority was unquestioned, those he had appointed to govern were able to reach out to fellow nobles and the public when making decisions. By the Warring States period, the opposite had become true. Local rulers had to secure themselves against potential overthrow by their own citizens and administrators. Thus, the market, once a potential for garnering support, is now a liability. Merchants exhibiting extravagant wealth, wicked youths roaming in bands, and assassins hiding as butchers or beggars were all dangers that emerged from the marketplace. Excavations have not been able to produce where the market square or squares were located in Linzi, but texts and tomb drawings of other cities such as Chengdu suggest that most marketplaces were equipped with a central guard tower and laid out in a grid, much like a small version of the concentric city model. With this background, let us consider again. Why is the interior wall the thickest? And why does the double city model emerge alongside the older concentric city model? There is a theory established by Wu Heng that answers both of these questions. In 386 BC, a coup led by the leading ministerial family overthrew the lineage of Qi that had been ruling since the Western Zhou. Since this date falls within the period scholars believe the second palace city wall to have been constructed, it is possible that an originally concentric city was rebuilt with a strengthened power base in the southwest, where the ministerial family may have resided. Thus, they were more wary of counter-revolutions inside the city than threats beyond the walls. This is just one way that the double city typology could have emerged, and its popularity during the Warring States period may be an indication of the political turmoil of that time. Subsequent imperial rulers, eager to emphasize their infallibility and central importance, would have no desire for such haphazard arrangements. Due to the nature of archaeological excavation, it can be tempting to see cities as entirely two-dimensional entities, with the third vertical dimension indicating time rather than space. This impression is reinforced by early texts and drawings describing buildings and cities laid out across the land, such as the Kaogongji section of the Rites of Zhou. But Lewis reminds us of the growing importance of the vertical element in Warring States constructions. During the Western Zhou dynasty, power emanated from the king of Zhou to the fiefdoms of his kinsmen, whose position above the commoners but below the supreme king was unquestioned. In the Warring States period, the vacuum of power left by the Zhou king was filled by competing, theoretically equal state rulers. This competition led to the erection of more elaborate city walls, gates, and towers. A significant feature of ancient Linzi was its great tower, anachronistically called the Platform of Duquan, a famous Qi ruler and the first hegemon. The platform stands 14 meters tall today, but was likely much taller when first built. From it, the ruler of Qi could survey his city, his territory, and possibly the territory of the surrounding states. It would also serve as an imposing landmark, reminding any visitors of the greatness of Qi. Cities were undergoing unique transformations during the Warring States period, and the Qi capital of Linzi is an example of how geopolitical, economic, and social factors shaped these cities.